Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a little commentary on another part of the Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro conversation from Sunday, and also a part from Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin that was on the Rubin Report with two other individuals. I wasn't familiar with these two other individuals. One's into Ayn Rand, and the other is a materialist of some sort, I think an economist. But I thought Peterson was very clear in that video. Now, we still haven't had the opportunity to publicly view the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversations from Vancouver. I think those were good conversations, at least the audio versions that I've heard. But both of these talks came quite closely on the heels, and so I think we can get a sense both from Harris and from Peterson of themselves. And in both cases, they're talking to different individuals that are bringing out some different things, obviously. But I thought both of these clips that I'm about to show you are quite clear. Now, in the past, sometimes I've run through the clips, then I've gone back and done commentary. I think I'm just going to run through the clips. It's Friday, and I have to do my rough draft for Sunday video. And Fridays are the end of the week for me, and they're always impacted because Sunday's coming and Saturday's normally my day off. So that'll give you some reason why videos are usually front loaded at the beginning of the week. I might post this video on Saturday and my rough draft for Friday video on Friday. I still continue to tinker with, when do you post the video? Although sometimes I just want to post them to get them out of there. And often I'll post them ahead of time on the audio channel only just because it's easier. And they go up fast on the audio channel. So if you're listening to the audio only podcast version, sometimes you'll get something a little bit earlier than the YouTube version. Sometimes it's the other way around. So let's take a look at this, because I thought on the whole this was a rather interesting conversation between Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro. And here at the end, Harris gets into ought and is, and Harris is trying to defend his view of how you can get an ought from an is, and that's very much the topic of the other Jordan Peterson conversation that we'll see. And so we're basically going to run this or do commentary through the end of this talk here. But this is an interesting section.
For me, is given all the minds as they are, where should we want to go, both individually and collectively? And there are multiple. There may be.
And even right there, where should we want to go? Okay, so we're in the world of should, and this, what he's about to say here, gets quite interesting.
Multiple right answers to this. It's not that there's just one sort of life that is the best possible life. There's a range of different lives that, given 1,000,000 years to talk about it, we might not be able to distinguish which is better or worse.
Now, if you look back in the short little group of 3 videos where I talked about eschatology and Sam Harris, this is very much where it comes into play. Often when I listen to them talk about reason, I get the sense of eschatology now, that if I would only employ reason, then somehow within my lifetime the kingdom can be fully realized in myself. Now, this is where the eschatological conversation and the materialist gets very interesting, because I'm now in my mid-50s. I'm going to have a birthday this month, and, well, it's too late for me, baby. I mean, what do I got? Maybe tops, who knows what's going to happen with medical science. Maybe 50 more years. That's tops. Well, is that going to be enough to fully realize rationality? Can I listen to Sam Harris or Matt Dillahunty and have my rationalist conversion and become this rationalist person? And therefore, no, because we have to wait for science to evolve, and we have to wait for everyone to get rational, and all of that kingdom coming is dependent upon us getting rational. And here Sam Harris is like, millions of years, and I'm thinking, but dude, you're one off and done. You've only got one life to live. By the time you shuffle off this mortal coil, baby, you go into null land. So,
is Chinese food better than Thai food, right? Like there's a range of differences there which don't matter for better or worse. It's just different, right? And And yet, at the end of the day, if you really preferred one and I really preferred the other, we could find some reason why that's the case. I mean, well, you might be a super taster of certain tastes on your,
Now this is part of the difficulty of last week's Sunday school class, I mentioned again that there are at least 4 words in Greek that get translated as love in the English language. Reason, if you listen carefully to this, and again, a lot of this exercise is slowing down. Listen carefully. If you look at the beginning of Biblical Series 5A, my commentary on it, I played that Will Schroeder video. And so much of learning is slowing down, thinking about it as it goes through, listening carefully, listening to it multiple times. I've probably listened to this clip now 5-6 times. And every time I listen to it, I hear more things, or things are clearer, or actually this clip has more or less, at least for the moment, been exhausted for me in terms of what I think I can get out of it. But if you slow Harris down, and we have the opportunity to do this with YouTube, we can pause them, we can think, we can listen. This is one of the amazing things about YouTube. You can pause a conversation and just ponder it. And this is, in a sense, what this entire video learning experience for me has been about, in terms of I get to butt in on these conversations, and I get to listen to them, and I get to think through them, and I get to talk about them out loud. And even sometimes talking about them out loud engages more senses than just thinking about them in my head, because when I talk about them out loud, that actually activates more systems within me, and my ears get to hear what I say. And then sometimes I almost never go back and watch my videos. But if later on I think, oh yeah, I said something about that Harris Shapiro interview, go back and listen. And sometimes I go back and listen to myself, or more often have this with what I've written on my blog. I go back and read something on my blog that I've written 2, 3, 5, 8 years ago, and I think, oh, then this gets into the conversation. Was I a different person? I experienced myself as a different person when I look back on myself in time, but here I'm rambling, so let's keep going.
Exactly. But then it's still coherent to ask, should we, like, if we could really intrude in the brain and change our intuitions about better and worse, right?
That is such an interesting phrase. If we could really intrude in the brain, and just the way he phrases it, you get a mental picture of the relationship between him, the brain, and the mind.
Right? If I could change your sense of the rightness of certain actions or the wrongness, we could make this we could ask this additional question of whether that would be good. Because that would be a new way of navigating in the space. And this brings you to your Brave New World question. So, like, if it's possible to, now let's say we had a cure for sadness, right? This is an example I've used before where
I like this illustration. This is interesting, especially on the within the Brave New World conversation, because of course Soma, and if you haven't read Brave New World or listened to the audiobook, by all means do so, because even a philosopher converted from Reformed Christianity to Roman Catholicism, Peter Kreeft, calls it a revelation.
We have a pill that perfectly cancels the feeling of grief, say. So at what point after the death of a loved one would you want to take this pill, right? And the answer might be never, and you would have a reason why that was the case.
Now again, pay attention to all the different ways he uses this word reason. Now we can navigate this, but looking at the relationships between these various definitions and uses of the word reason is important. It's also well, let's keep going.
But you could imagine someone who's just so destroyed by the experience of grief that they just can't get their life back on track. Everyone in their life is worried about them. They're on the verge of suicide. At a certain point, you'd say, well, let's just give you this pill and just see if we can bring a little daylight in there, even if you were against using it for yourself, sure. Right?
And I really enjoy this illustration because it illuminates so much about, you've got a hierarchy of values. So, and I really appreciate that this is Sam Harris talking in this way, because he's the one that has this conception of our moral basis being a sense of conscious well-being. Well, Is he denying his argument? Is he nuancing his argument? Well, I'm not sure. He's making the argument, and obviously within his own mind, this is coherent and self-consistent with the rest of his argument. But the question of whether a loved one who has seen a horrific accident and lost someone that they love decides whether or not to take the pill, well, why wouldn't you, even though you're causing all of this mental anguish, this anguish in your consciousness? Well, you wouldn't, because this is putting you in touch with the real world. Well, what is the real world? Well, the real world is that your beloved has died. Okay, well, they've gone to naught. They've gone to null. All right, if you've seen the article that someone posted on, Sam Harris isn't really plus 10 to minus 10, and death is 0. Death is null value. You're outside of it. So at least in Sam Harris's universe, the dead person is not suffering. The living person is grieving the loss of their beloved. Now, in a sense, what this pill does is doesn't take them to null, or does it? Brings them to 0, so they don't experience it. And Sam Harris, I think, rightly says, well, this would be wrong. Well, why would it be wrong? Because, in a sense, love demands that the beloved be grieved. And to not grieve, to not feel this pain, betrays the love. Now, what of this is material? This is all relational, and it's highly relational. So let's imagine you're a neighbor who doesn't have much connection to this whole situation, and it's probably the neighbor that looks at the person who's beset by grief and says, you can't live this way. Take the pill. Take the pill. Well, why? I'm mourning the death of my beloved. Take the pill. Well, why does the neighbor want them to take the pill? Well, the grief in the eyes of the neighbor, even if they don't have a strong relationship, is firing the motor neurons of the neighbor, and now they are experiencing anguish, and their anguish is separated, and there's no love in there. So should the neighbor take the pill? Or, because this is exactly how human relationships work, or should the neighbor try to coerce the person, please don't suffer in front of me because your suffering is making me suffer, because of the biology and the psychology of my mirror neurons firing, seeing you in pain puts me in pain, and I don't want to be in pain, so have no love. Do not mourn the beloved. Take the pill. And then Sam Harris's illustration here where he says, well, but if their life is really falling apart, well, isn't that the point of mourning? Isn't that the point? Isn't that the expression? And so what we have here is Sam Harris has somewhere in his mind a calibration of grief. And this, I would assert, is a culturally constructed calibration of grief. When, for example, I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, when we do the death of a pastor, I remember a funeral for a pastor, the Haitian, especially the Haitian women, sometimes the men, were very expressive in their grief. I remember a situation where I was at an ordination service of an elder in the Korean church, and the wife of the elder looked like someone had just taken the life of a beloved person in her life. And she was all over the place. And this was all happening in Korean, and I had a Korean friend sitting next to me. I said, what's the deal with this woman? Because in my mind, in my culturally constructed way, her act was inappropriate. He said, oh no, all of this emotion is because she is so happy that her husband will now be installed as an elder in a Korean church. And to be an elder in a Korean church is a very big deal. So Sam Harris is, well, life falling apart. Well, what do you mean? Do we give him the pill when it gets life-threatening? Well, here again, you have this hierarchy of values, and all of this is any of this rational according to his standard of rationality, even within this own illustration? Well, we're going to allow this person to grieve for a certain number of days but we're not going to allow it to get life-threatening, so that they're suicidal. And so, yeah, definitely I don't want them to commit suicide. I remember I did a funeral for someone who this person's son promised to show, see, being a pastor, you get all these stories. this person's son promised, his family was trying to keep him from the funeral, partly because this child was born out of wedlock and the family situation was very complicated. And this son, he was in his 20s at this point, basically promised to go to the funeral, drape himself on his father's casket, and take his own life. Didn't happen. I'm not sure. I don't think I ever believed the threat. I think a lot of the family didn't believe the threat, but given the dramatic situation of this man's death and the family all at their extremes emotionally, this rather dramatic, oh, how shall we say it? This rather dramatic promise to do this rather horrible thing was certainly not welcome. But again, what is required in some cultures, of course, in the world, if a certain family member dies, another family member takes their life or is buried with them. The servants of pharaohs were buried in the pyramids with their pharaoh. Now, Sam Harris would say, well, this is just wrong. This is irrational. They don't need those servants to go into the afterlife in Egypt. We should be getting rid of all of this. Well, and very quickly when you start deconstructing it, you begin to see the cultural layers. Whereas, let's say, a squad of soldiers. I just watched Gran Torino again last night. What a fun movie Gran Torino is. But often you'll have soldiers who come back from the battlefield and all their buddies die, very much have the sense of, I should have died too. And that then will get into their behavior. Now, Sam Harris might say, well, that's irrational. Well, it's not based on any religion. Well, what's it based on? Well, it's based on psychology. Well, is it irrational? How are we to evaluate any of this scenario that you have just set up in terms of should? And again, I love the illustration because the illustration illuminates so much, but I don't think it helps his cause. And for that reason, I don't quite understand. In fact, just about everything I'm about to play, I don't quite understand, quite frankly, how this works for him or how this fits into his schema.
Right. But presumably, you wouldn't want to take it 30 seconds after your kid was run over by a bus. You just see the worst thing that's ever happened in your life happen, and then you just pop this pill and you don't feel anything, one way or the other about it, right? You're ready to go to Starbucks, right? That would be a complete fragmentation of who you are with respect to the love you feel or felt for your child, right? Like what does loving your child mean if immediately upon his or her death, you want to cancel your grief and you feel great, right?
So what does loving your child mean? That's the question. Can reason answer this? Any reasoning we're doing is going to be based on the presuppositions of what love is and what relationships are and what a human being is. Now, obviously, he believes he can construct this all with reason and that this construction can somehow be outside of time and permanent for basically just like the laws of physics. I simply don't buy it.
So we don't know it'd be hard to find the right answer, and this kind of thing is very likely coming, by the way, right? It's very likely we will one day have a cure for grief, right? And we'll have to figure out how to use it, and there will be wrong ways to use it. But I think what we want, I think the intuition that causes you to ask this question about Aldous Huxley and Brave New World is that we're right to want to be anchored to reality in some sense, and if we were ever faced with
even the way that is phrased, and this I think is really illustrative of why C.S. Lewis frames his arguments in his book Miracles the way he does. How Sam Harris just said that places us outside of both reality and nature, because I think when Sam Harris says reality, he means nature. And this goes to Brett Weinstein saying we are assassin robots and we have to transcend our programming. This goes to the argument that that somehow global warming, by us pumping so much CO2 into the atmosphere, is unnatural. Well, if we are purely natural, running through our programs, determined, without will, free of, completely part of nature, part of the whole show, then what we are doing to cook the world is natural. It's no less natural than the dinosaurs dying, than the tiger eating the goat, than anything else in the world. And when the tiger eats the goat, we don't say to the tiger, you ought not to eat the goat. But when the serial killer, I've been watching Mindhunter on Netflix. Wow, what a good series. It's so provocative. When we think about a serial killer, we say the serial killer doing that is different from the tiger eating the goat. Why do we say that? Oh, that's all part of our programming. I think you just simply give up the game.
With an opportunity of just uploading ourselves into a simulation where just the world is a video game and nothing is real, right? So like our states of happiness.
And again, when he says nothing is real here, he means nothing is here in meat space being worked out. It's not me. Now, Taylor, if you're watching the video, let me know if this is your water cup, because it's been sitting in my office now since the last time you came to a meetup. And I'm not just trying to be a pastor saying, I should probably look up your email address and email you and take a picture of it. But here in meat space, where this was left at a meetup, and I think Taylor left it, and I think, well, this is not natural. But yet, Sam Harris would say, well, this is real. And okay, so real and natural, you're distinguishing that. But this is real. But now we're into the phenomenology question is, if I am in a simulation, how would I know? Let's imagine now when we talk about computer simulations, we have specific ideas in mind. I have these little boxes that I call computers. And when I play a computer game, the one computer game I enjoy playing is Civilization. When I play Civilization, I'm not actually thinking that my little armies are dying. These are just zeros and ones. But you don't have to imagine this to be a simulation without meat space. That's kind of an interesting lack of imagination by the person telling the story. What the illustration is trying to say is that this morning, for example, I woke up in the early morning hours. I'd gone to bed on time, and this happens sometimes. I wake up in the night, and then I work on my sermon in my head, and I have some time of prayer, and I get some ideas for videos. And my wife is sleeping. I don't want to bother her, so I maybe listen to some podcasts with some headphones or something like that. And then I finished my sermon early, and then it was still quite early. I thought, well, I'll just take a little nap. And so I take a little nap, and boom, I'm in dream state right away. But I'm in that liminal space where I kind of know I'm in dream state, and then you can kind of play around with your dreams a little bit. Okay, well, is that real? Is that what you're talking about when you're talking about a computer simulation? Is that what you're talking when you're talking about us? And again, we've talked about this in terms of philosophy and such. But Sam Harris wants to say, well, real. I get so frustrated with that word because we're all sneaking things underneath it. And we really have to come to terms with it. It's reason, real, res, Latin. Oops, wrong way.
Are totally divorced from the reality of our lives, right? And our actual relationships and the conscious experience of other people. That would be a bad thing, right? And yet, we could imagine a circumstance of maximizing pleasure in a way that's divorced from reality. And that's an interesting argument to have ethically, because I think our intuitions about that could change to some degree. And I think that there are ways in which we're already in something very much like a simulation that's not, to talk about what is real in this context is interesting. But I share your bias here. I share the sense that there are versions of pure pleasure, Brave New World futures where everyone's a heroin addict, perfectly medicated. That's not good, right?
I don't get it. I just don't get what you're doing here, Sam. I don't get it. I don't get your telos. I don't get your end goal. You tell me that good is defined by conscious well-being, and Ben Shapiro says, well, what about Brave New World? No, that's not good. Why? I don't get it.
And I think you can adjudicate that based on other possible experiences in the landscape of all possible experiences that are clearly better. And you would make an argument based on evaluating those experiences.
Okay, so this is one of those episodes where it's just, I'm going to be devastated that we don't have a second hour to actually...
Come on, Ben. What's 2 hours going to cost you? Really? Really? Get a computer and a camera and do it on the cheap and give us more hours.
Go into all of these issues because we basically scratched the surface on all of this. But sort of final parting question, because we didn't even get into rationality or free will, exactly. A couple places where I'm sure we have more disagreements.
But I have a very short answer to that piece.
Perfect. Okay.
Sam, not a good move to give the short answer, because the short answer, I've listened to it 5 times, and I don't think you're helping yourself with this.
So go for it.
So rationality, and I think I might have said this to you on stage at our event, rationality is not, the successful moments of reasoning are not examples where freedom of will is even tempting to ascribe. I mean, so it's if I give you an argument, if you strongly believe one thing, and I give you an argument that persuades you, that just knocks down the row of dominoes in your mind, that leads you to think.
Right, no, I understand.
Okay. Listen, let's hear it again. Because when first time I heard this, I act before I speak. I run around the room. I pull my hair out, and see, I've done that a lot lately. There's nothing left. So let's listen to this again.
If you attempt this to you on stage at our event, rationality is not, the successful moments of reasoning are not examples where freedom of will is even tempting to ascribe. I mean, so it's
where freedom of will is even tempting to ascribe. Now, I want to give the guy some slack here. He's talking extemporaneously on camera. He's not reading from a script. I say plenty of incoherent things on my videos, and if you want to go back and find them, you'll have an easy time. But I'm trying to make sense of what he's about to say.
It's, if I give you an argument, if you strongly believe one thing, and I give you an argument that persuades you, that just knocks down the row of dominoes in your mind, that leads you to think.
Right, no, I understand your argument.
First of all, that doesn't happen. Towards the end, which I'm probably not going to show, the guy second from right, left, gosh, dyslexia, what a mess. Not the guy with the gray hair, not Jordan Peterson, not Dave Rubin, the other guy. He makes an argument that, arguments do persuade, but usually not in the moment, something to that effect, which I think is exactly right. And Sam Harris says, this is the rationalists' great dream. Let's say the great instead of another word. This is the rationalist's great dream, that I'm going to make an argument. Christian apologetics have this dream, and we all have this dream, because, well, what's this dream of? This dream is of colonizing another human being, that I can give you an argument and just destroy the other argument, and then someone can make a tiny little YouTube video and just propagate it all over the place. Sam Harris destroys Paul Vanderklay. Woo! What this argument is going to do is knock down the dominoes, and I think that's what C.S. Lewis talks about in terms of colonizing, that rationality will be so powerful that will willingly submit. This is something what C.S. Lewis talks about, the specific pleasure of the inferior, where the dog happily submits to its master, and the child happily submits to its parent, and the servant happily submits to the master. Or let's say you're a fan of Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or someone else, and they make an argument that is just clear as day to you, and you happily follow what they say. That's what we're talking about here. Okay. Will is not involved. Now, Shapiro's going to jump on him for this, and rightly so.
It's a naturalistic response to a reasonable argument. You don't have any control over that.
But you don't have any control over over any moment where you finally see the light.
So you don't have any control over any moment where you finally see the light. Okay. So why are you admonishing people to do this?
You do a chain of reasoning and it works. That's a moment where you are changed by something extrinsic to your own volition, right?
So my basic response to that is yes and no, because you see people who clearly resist the impact of a reasonable argument on themselves.
Yes, but the resistance is what it is to be unreasonable or to.
First, let's listen to this again.
Under the
argument is reasonable argument. You don't have any control over that.
But you don't have any control over any moment where you finally see the light. So where I give you a chain of reasoning and it works. That's a moment where you are changed by something extrinsic to your own volition, right?
So you're changed. I mean, this isn't any different from getting drugged or I don't know if the degree to which hypnotism and volition gets involved, but somehow someone is rewiring your brain and you are doing something and it's not you, and no court will ever find you responsible for that act. Is that what we're talking about?
My basic response to that is yes and no, because you see people who clearly resist the impact of a reasonable argument on themselves.
Yes, but the resistance is what it is to be unreasonable or to be.
Ought? So reason is something that you can't resist, but the resistance is unreasonable.
Be under the sway of wishful thinking or confirmation.
Right, but the bottom line is that from my perspective, that is somebody, if the idea is that reason is basically just eliciting a particular response, then people have the capacity to override their ability to listen to reason.
Which I would say is what we usually call free will. I could listen to reason and happily submit to it, or I could resist it. Now, whatever the cause of my resistance, whether I'm hoodwinked by ancient stories of miracles and men in the sky and angels and things, or if I'm just a jerk and I just want to say no just to tick you off, or whatever reason I have, that's my choice. But he just finished saying there is no choice involved. It's just dominoes falling. It's just piano keys playing. And then he says, yeah, but that's what we call unreasonable. I would love someone to be able to explain this to me, because hearing this, it just simply sounds absolutely incoherent. And I think C.S. Lewis's take on it, which is colonization, which is that's in a sense what I think that's the best picture we have for this very, very interesting interpersonal dynamic.
If you're going to ascribe that to free will, that's a different thing to ascribe. But that, again, I wouldn't. You don't need free will to explain that. But that's that.
What? This ending just continues to baffle me.
That is, take the reasoning piece. If I give you the quintessential moment of it, I give you a column of numbers to add up.
Right.
You have 0 degrees of freedom if you're going to actually be doing arithmetic.
Has he ever taught math to children? I see the children having a lot of freedom. Now they get it wrong, and maybe they choose to get it wrong. Often they don't get it wrong. I don't know what kind of universe he's imagining.
So then the final question here, because we're going to have you inflate.
Come on, Ben, give the man more time. We want more time.
A 4-hour session here in Just Schmooze, but is the argument in favor of reason a moral reason is good argument, or is the argument a utilitarian reason is useful argument, or is it both? Because
I think that's a good question, but I don't know if there can be good in Sam Harris's universe.
Because I can imagine a lot of ways to convince people of things that don't involve me making arguments to them, and that historically have been used to great success with horrible, horrific human carnage. Obviously.
Well, you're not necessarily convincing them in that case. You're just
forcing them.
Forcing them.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, then what then is the difference between convincing and forcing? Because you just told us that what reason is giving a drag down, the best argument that just knocks down the dominoes in the other person's mind that was completely convinced. Well, that's not reasoning, that's forcing. I don't understand the universe he is trying to construct for us here.
Although I would say that you can indoctrinate fully millions of people into, you would think this too, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
that it's possible to indoctrinate people not using reason into fully formed belief systems.
Yeah.
So when you make the argument for reason, are you saying that reason is morally better? And if so, why is reason morally better than, for example, the appeal of passion, which has obviously motivated billions of people over time?
Right. Well, I don't think they're as separable as many people think. I think you can't reason, and there's neurological evidence to back this up. And Antonio Damasio did this work decades ago, where if you have certain neurological injuries in the orbital medial prefrontal cortex, you can't be moved by the products of your, quote, reasoning, because reason has to be anchored to emotion in a very direct way. And you can actually feel this in yourself. So if I say something that starts to sound like bull to you, right, that feeling of doubt, the feeling that you have detected errors in my chain of reasoning, that feels like something. That is an emotion, right? And if you couldn't feel that, if it was all just cold.
I've been getting very emotional during listening to this. And sorry for my audio listeners. I'm up in the corner. I'm just saying yes, yes, yes.
Cold and calculating and just.
That's why sociopaths, can't reason their way to virtually anything.
Well, they can.
Reverse can reason their way to everything.
They can reason fine. Unfortunately, they just don't care about other people's experience. So they're very. They're very manipulative in ways that you and I wouldn't.
But reason itself doesn't arrive at a moral answer in any case.
So for me, reason is the only thing that, again, as we talked about at the top of this, it's the only thing that takes us out of who we are and scales to some universal point of view. It's
read Miracles, C.S. Lewis's Miracles, because this reason pulls us out of who we are. It scales. Listen to what you're saying. You can't be part of nature and say these things, because any attempt to do this would simply be an illusory thing. And then in a sense, we're looking at Hinduistic or Buddhistic worldviews, where this experience of being an individual, of being of having an ego, of choosing, this is all illusory.
It's not. It's you're not reasoning. If you're actually reasoning, what you're arriving at is not just true for you. It's true for anyone who could be in. It's true from essentially above on any given topic.
Bingo, the monarchical vision. It's true from above. We see the world apart from persons. We see a space for objects. We see it clearly. We see it thoroughly. Here, of course, is the problem. No human being can do this. No human being can do this, because we are subjective. We have biases. We are irrational. We are unreasonable. Again, this is the first 8 chapters, the first 10 chapters of C.S. Lewis's book. He walks through all of this, and in a sense, he's saying, well, this is the monarchical vision. We are seeing from above, and we are seeing everything, and we're seeing it purely, and we are seeing it in a sense in an eternal frame. There is no time in this moment, and my friend sending me more and more Heidegger, which is really helpful, by the way.
But it does offer the view from above, or the view from any possible perspective.
A view from outside every perspective.
Or at least it takes into account the effect of perspective. So it's like if
really,
again, reason is, and scientific rationality generally, is the thing that explains why, if you're colorblind, you don't see colors the way I do, right? And that's it. It's not that we can't get at what's actually real. We can, because we can explain divergences of opinion. And otherwise you just have those divergences.
Well, we are definitely going to have you back for a much longer conversation.
So, wow. There's a great Saturday Night Live skit of Donald Trump and Lester Holt after the firing of Comey. and where the Saturday Night Live guy is like, you know, did I get him? Did I get him? Oh, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to play that. I'm not going to play that for you. I'll link it in the notes because obviously if I play it for you, my video will get taken down because NBC. Anyway, you know why. But I feel that when I watch this video because it's like, oh. I just don't know what to think of this. Now let's move along and let's take a look at another video, the second video I want to watch. Piano keys or a form for action. And this is Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, Greg Salmieri, and Yaron Brook. I don't know Salmieri or Yaron. I didn't know either of these two gentlemen, but this is a very, very interesting conversation. It's on Dave Rubin's channel, and it's well worth watching. And so what happens is that Peterson's ongoing conversation with Sam Harris is very much in his head. And so these other guys are kind of proxies. They're all dealing with the same questions and the same issues. And so again, a friend said, you know, you really got to watch this video again because this Peterson is very, very clear in this video. And I think he is really sharp in here, and he gets his argument down and narrow and focused about, okay, what is, well, let's just jump into it because I think it's really quite good.
On that.
What I've observed is, for example, in my clinical practice, when I'm talking about life and death moral issues, and these are in situations where extreme things are happening in families and in individuals' lives, talking about events that might have produced post-traumatic stress disorder or that set people up for murder at times, or suicide, like, or terrible suffering, some of which is induced voluntarily, the probability that I can have a discussion with my clients about that at a level that will be salutary without using religious/metaphorical language is zero. If the discussion can't take place in the domain of good versus evil, something like that, and this is especially true, I would say, for post-traumatic stress disorder, you just don't get anywhere with it.
And again, one of the things I appreciate about Peterson is his wisdom in these things comes out of the practical. He's not simply a pundit. Well, his status rocket has launched him out of the ability to see normal people anymore. As a practitioner, maybe if his status rocket lands someplace, he can do that again. I don't know. But again, his experience is similar to mine. Now, as a pastor, instead of a therapist or a clinician, a psychological clinician, people come to me, I always talk about the religious, but I have to have some sense of some capacity to distinguish the two. But what he just said here in terms of when you get down to life and death things, the religious language is that which is at hand and that which we default to. And I will regularly find atheist people employing religious language because it's just the best way to try to talk about it. So that makes sense. Keep going.
And I've been thinking about the narrative issue a lot, constantly. And I think that, we need to use, this is one of the weaknesses of the rationalist argument, I think, is that we have to use heuristics to operate in the world. So heuristics are simplifying maneuvers. And there's no option. You have to use heuristics. And the reason for that is because there is a lot more world than there is of you. And so you take this incredibly complex reality and you simplify it. And now the simplifications have to have merit. And what makes them have merit is a topic for a very lengthy discussion. But to produce those simplifications, you have to use heuristics. You have to use cognitive shortcuts. And it looks to me like narrative is a heuristic. And that the reason that we need to tell stories and that we probably need to have our ethic grounded in stories is because you can't make a list of rules that will tell you how to live. Rules don't suffice, but you can tell stories that lay out broad principles, and those are heuristic principles.
Now, story as heuristic, I think, is really helpful, but it's an interesting type of heuristic, because I don't know if story necessarily simplifies or whether it converts it to I'm going to use computer language again. It's going to convert it to a type of code that we can access. And again, this gets back into my emerging ontology in terms of my schema in terms of what a human being is. If we are a story, well, we are built to run stories well. That's what our brains are set to do. We are built to interpret the world as a story. And this is where you get into, again, the Weekly Standard article that I refer to often, entitled The Heretic, about Thomas Nagel and this meeting of celebrity atheists in the Berkshires. We interpret the world as story. That is a 3.5 million years, as Peterson says. That's how we've arrived at this capacity to interpret story. This is how we function in the world. Now, you listen to, let's say, Don Hoffman. Is the world story in that sense? The world is stranger than we can imagine, okay? But story is clearly a powerful means. It is probably our best means at interacting with the world. So in a sense, a list of rules or a list of descriptions, and I've done this in my other videos, let's stop whatever you're doing and sit down and list everything that is around you. And you can go on for near forever. I can't say forever, but near forever. Reality, we cannot process that way, but we can. We have this tremendous capacity to process reality as story and to take this incredibly broad world and distill it into a story. And if you think about the difference between a novel and, let's say, a movie or a television program, what does the director do? The director on TV or movie, they direct the eye and they direct the story. And so story is a particularly powerful heuristic that our brains are optimized. This is the water in which we swim. This is the environment we are made for. And so Peterson is dead on right. And he's going to go here with this. The rationalist almost asserts we're living in this world of bricks, and these bricks are facts. And we are Amazon warehouse workers manipulating objects. And Peter says we're bad at that. Computers are far better at that than we are, and so in fact we program computers to do this. But the computers cannot process story the way we can process story. Story is our native code, okay? And it's a heuristic, and by means of this story, we can take this incredibly rich world and we can manipulate it and process it and communicate it and transfer it, and do all these amazing things back and forth and live within it. And what's amazing about story, and again, he goes off into the postmoderns with respect to this, and also in terms of the Bible, what's amazing about story is when you read a story, the author packs more into the story than even the human author knows they are packing into the story. That is phenomenal, because others can come to the story and pull more out of it. Story is like that. It's an amazingly powerful heuristic. It does simplify, and so that in that sense it's a heuristic, but it's a very special kind that does things the likes of which we cannot even imagine, and that we continue to work on. And this is why the Bible, again, with my last videos, there's a baseline story that is canon that doesn't change, but these levels above it and how we interact with it, this is just how we go. And this is why those who imagine the world to be a group of Amazon boxes, they will simply never win, because that's just not how we're built. Now, these are secondary programming languages that some highly intelligent people can manipulate and access and talk with. But even when you listen to Sam Harris talk about that kind of world, he keeps defaulting into story, because this is just how we are and just how we live.
No, but the thing is that the most fundamental stories seem to have a religious core. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that is, although I think it probably has to do with something I referred to earlier, which is the idea that, you know, you are, as a soul, you're the thing that transforms potential into actuality. That seems to be the ground.
He used the word soul there. That's very interesting. There are a number of other words he could have used as an agent, as a person, but he used the word soul. Now, again, he's on stage. This is coming out of his brain, and it's coming out of his mouth as a live stream, baby. And so I'm not... Anybody that's doing these events, we should give them maximal mercy for correction after the fact, because to speak live on camera like this is no easy thing, and everyone who's doing this, Sam Harris included, Matt Dillahunty included, I have esteem for all of them, because this is tremendously difficult stuff, and it's far easier to sit behind your little computer screen and be a pundit like I'm doing. But it's still interesting to hear the word soul in this context.
Grounding concept in some sense. So that's the grounding concept. There's something divine about that. Out of that arises a sequence of
something divine about that. See, again, it's religious language, and as someone who works in theology, now I'm not technically a theologian, I'm a pastor. Pastors are practitioners. We're not really theoreticians.
Of stories that are shaped across perhaps evolutionary history, and inside that our more articulated ethic exists. And I don't see a way out of that, because you cannot make an exhaustive list of rules that enable ethical movement forward, and you'd need to do that if you had a purely rational view of the way that human cognition functions. It's something
right. And rational in terms of, I think Peterson is right in listening to the rationalists that, see, we can't even process this without a story. How we process this and examine this is via our words. We tell a little story, give a little word picture. And Peterson is right that the world is made up of facts, and these facts are like little Amazon boxes or little bricks. And again, in the theological tradition, there was a time, end of the 19th century, this got very popular, and it lingers into the 20th and into the 21st century, that we can break down the Bible into a set of propositional truths. And I can pull Louis Berkhoff off the shelf, a blue book about this wide, and a very tiny group of you will know exactly what book I'm talking about. And in a sense, you can distill the Christian life into a line of facts. You can put it into an algorithm. And in a sense, so much evangelism has become this processing of facts, and even in fact the evangelistic methods of that time period are embedded within this culture, because okay, I'm going to get, so you take this little verse out of Paul and you say, okay, if we believe with our hearts and profess with our lips, well, there it is, boom boom, Christian. Okay, but does that really get it? Does that really exhaust it? No. And Peterson is right that, here again, look at how I have simply tried to process all of these little fact bricks. I have told them into a story, and that's the best way I can imagine it, I can process it, I can communicate it. Now someone might say, but it's far more powerful to get rid of the story. Yuval Harari, when he sits and meditates, he tries to get rid of all story. That's what he says in his video. Tries to get rid of all story. You're not going to be talking to people, because when he writes his book, he puts it back into story. Okay, well, where are you getting the filler to put it back in your story? You've apparently gone into your little clean room, your little mental meditation clean room, and you've been able to get all the story out of it. Now you're going to fill story back in. What was that pink meat stuff that was in the chicken nuggets that everyone was complaining about? Where's the filler coming? You're going to have to do story. It's just how people work.
So let's pause right there. Can either one of you figure out a way out of that? I mean, that would be the answer that an objectivist would want to have, right? Here we are. We got a whole bunch of them right in front of you.
So I don't know what this OCON, I don't know what that is. I'm sure someone in the comment section will tell me what it is, or maybe I'll have to Google it. Is it an atheist group? Is it a rationalist group? I have no idea.
I don't think you could have a list of rules if the rule, you're meaning something like an algorithm that you live your life by.
Exactly.
And
an algorithm.
I think that's just not something we can do. That's not the way the human mind works, and the world is complicated, and you're not going to get a bunch of if-then statements that take you to...
Yay! Yes, he gets it.
But I mean, you can't even do that for a lot of physical systems to explain them.
Right.
But I think we can understand them rationally. This might be similar to what we were talking about in the green room about Sam's view of reason and yours and mine. We might got to figure out where they all lie.
Yeah, what is this reason we're talking about?
But I don't think reason is just about coming up with algorithms. I think we come up with concepts. Concepts enable us to assimilate vast quantities of similar things to one another and learn from about future instances from past ones. We can get quite subtle principles, but I think moral principles are not things that take the form of simple rules. Don't lie. They're, to take Rand's version of the virtue of honesty, which isn't don't lie, it's your recognition of the fact that what's unreal is unreal and it can't be of value. So faking things won't work. It won't make them real. Somehow the thing you fake is going to come back to haunt you. That's not a simple rule of what to do in each situation. It's a kind of broad fact that you can use to steer your life by. And in order to use it to steer your life by and to fully understand it, you need to think about how it plays out in a lot of different contexts, right? You need to think about what it really means in practice. And art, stories, but literature, but also other forms of art, I think, are an indispensable means to doing this, both with ethical truths like this and also with other metaphysical truths, views about what kind of world we're in.
So part of the discussion, and as it progresses, I don't necessarily mean this discussion in particular, but obviously I'm not an enemy of reason by any stretch of the imagination, but I do see that it's hard for people who promote reason as the fundamental mechanism to distinguish between reason and the generation of algorithms. And you can say, well, my concept of reason extends beyond the generation of algorithms, and fine, but then my question would be, well, exactly what are the mechanisms by which reason functions when what it's doing isn't generating algorithms? Because algorithms aren't enough, and we know that, right? Which is why we don't have it.
And again, when you heard Sam Harris before, he's talking about a math problem. That is how Sam Harris sees reason. It's like doing a math problem. It's like this argument that knocks over your dominoes. This is an algorithm for Sam Harris. And these two guys are saying, that can't be it. And so Peterson's saying, okay, then what is it?
Expert diagnostic systems, for example. So then the reason starts to look something like metaphor. It starts to look something like narrative. And then I start thinking, yeah, but that's not exactly the Enlightenment concept of reason. So we're starting to move into a different domain. And
I
so
think there's more than just algorithms and metaphor and narrative. I think, first of all, one thing reason can do is come up with metaphors and narratives. But there's more than just those three things.
One thing reason can do is come up with metaphors and narratives. And I agree with that. But that's a very different thing than Sam Harris was talking about. Now, again, I don't think Sam is clear on reason. He certainly hasn't articulated it that I understand. But what are we talking about? And again, I'd love to bring C.S. Lewis in the room. He died in 1963. But because for Lewis, again, reason is this taste of the supernatural because of how it functions between us, how we can employ it. Reason is not God, okay? But it is something that we can employ in a sense to transcend, to colonize nature, and which is exactly what all of us are doing here.
I also think there's the formation of abstract principles. I don't think what Newton did in writing the Principia was coming up with algorithms. There are algorithms in it, or things you can algorithmatize about how to prove certain things, but the act of forming the concept inertia, that's not exactly, that's something else. And I think it's...
Inertia might be an algorithm.
Yeah.
But the act of coming up with it
exactly.
is something, yes.
And I think there's a whole and underexplored area of philosophy and maybe cognitive psychology, thinking about what are these acts of reason? How does reason function? How is it that we can go from the kind of information we have in perception to a more and more sophisticated understanding of the world? And I've written some on this, other people have. I don't know how much I should try to explain here, but I can plug, I have a chapter called Conceptualization and Justification in a book called Concepts and Their Role in Knowledge that gives my sense of what reason does here.
See, because the other thing that's come up among the cognitive scientists in particular, and also the robotics types, is as people, and this is Rodney Brooks in particular, who invented the Roomba, by the way, but who's an absolute, well, it's a major accomplishment because the Roomba doesn't have a brain, but it operates intelligently. Like, it's a major accomplishment, that thing. And it took Brooks actually reconstructed how artificial intelligence robotics engineers were conceptualizing intelligence, and he thought of it as something much more embodied rather than conceptual. So it was the Roomba is actually the consequence of very, very high-level thinking about the relationship between reason and action in the world. Like, one of the things the more sophisticated cognitive psychologists have been wrestling with is the fact that a lot of what we thought of as abstract reason is actually something that's more dependent on embodiment than we'd ever possibly conceived, right? And so the idea of disembodied reason, which is also, I would say, an Enlightenment concept, seems to be lacking. It's lacking in functionality. You have to be embodied. And the thing to me is that an embodied reason looks to me a lot more like the hero of a story than it looks like disembodied reason. I think that's a better metaphor. And so partly why I like the idea of the logos, for example, rather than the idea of reason is because, and this is partly reflected in its conceptual Christian origins, because the logos in Christianity is something that's actually embodied, right? It's the Word made flesh. There's a link between the rational logos, logic, and the thing that's embodied. And it's the interaction between those two that produces the phenomenon that you described as what drove Newton, for example, when he was producing his algorithms. That's not an algorithm. But it's something else. But it's certainly not disembodied reason.
But even that metaphor of the Word made flesh, right? It sounds as though something that could have been disembodied was disembodied once, and now it got embodied.
Oh, now we're getting fun. Now we're playing in my playpen. Because when you let's think about the virgin birth. If you're a materialist, you say, well, how could God make Mary pregnant? I can't believe in the virgin birth. Read C.S. Lewis on the virgin birth. And again, people say to me, well, I can't believe in the virgin birth. Well, you believe Jesus could stand on a mountain and say, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me? And they'd say, yeah, he could say it, but it doesn't make it true. The question is it true? So in the Old Testament, let's go back to the story of Abraham and the three beings that show up, and this angel of the Lord being that gets pulled up, and when the Lord talks to Abraham about the destruction of Sodom. Think about the power to colonize. Now, what do we say when we say God is a spirit? In our materialist conception, we say God is less real than matter. That's just wrong. Again, I'm working on, maybe it's I don't know quite what the words to use, but what is reality? This question, what is reality? And that which is real at more layers and more aspects than other. If something is more real at more layers and aspects, it is more real than other things that are at less layers or aspects. For example, my thought that I have right now and the thought I'll have 3 moments from now that thought isn't terribly real because it doesn't transcend the fourth dimension very well. Thoughts in a book are a little bit more real, and this is an older book, so, and to the degree that the book continues to be useful and used and real, well, now it's going up in reality. Which book will outlast the other book? Well, and then of course there's this book, which has outlasted a lot of other books, and so now we're trying to have a schema about real and power and in a sense colonization. And so I don't think it's the case that, oh gosh, how to talk about this stuff. This is why theology is so hard. What I think his name is Greg. Oh, his name's up there. Greg, yeah, Greg. When the Word is made flesh, what does that mean? Well, this is a deep mystery. But it obviously, the power to colonize is there, because can you add? Can God? What is a miracle? Multiplying loaves and fishes. Well, what's that involve? You know, if you were to do a DNA analysis on the derivative fishes from Jesus multiplying loaves and fishes, would the derivative fishes have the same DNA as the fishes they took it from? I don't think God would necessarily be limited to that. Could he do that? Sure. You see that with twins. And then you get into later in C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. C.S. Lewis goes into ideas of the miracles of the old creation, miracles of the new creation. But the point here is that when God acts, it doesn't take anything away from him. And when the Logos comes in and the Word being made flesh, now again, if you do even if you look up, I don't know how good the Wikipedia article is on that, but if you look it up in a good theology book and you look at the past history of Logos in terms of its usage in Greek philosophy, its usage in the Hebrew scriptures, this is a very, very big deal here. And so, you know, the fact that we're appropriating religious language and we're talking about these things on this stage with these people. Someone made a comment to me, you know, it was that guy in Texas with his ball cap on and him shooting at the intellectual dark web. There isn't a Christian in the room, and Jordan Peterson is the closest we have to it. And he's doing a pretty darn good job for a guy who doesn't go to church, and his let's say his profession of Christian faith is complex and nuanced. He's doing a pretty darn good job on these stages bringing Christianity into these conversations, and I think that's part of the reason we're seeing the Jordan Peterson phenomenon as we're seeing it. But look at the conversation these people are having.
And so it still sounds to me a little bit too much like this disembodied conception of, if you want to call it reason or mind, whereas I think we want a conception of what reason is and what it does that involves the fact from the start that it's a feature of certain living organisms. These organisms have perceptual systems. Those are bodily, if anything is. And it's a faculty of integrating the data that's coming in through those organs, helping us direct ourselves through the world, and then on a grander and grander scale. So I do think in the Enlightenment, what we're getting is a lot of reflection for the first time, or for one of the first times, a renewed reflection on reason, what it is, how it works. And there are several different views, right? Some more materialistic views, like into Holbach and so forth, and then these more the Cartesian type views. And I think most of the views that came out of that are wrong. And I think it's sad because it's a period when people were really valuing the mind.
Well, they were productively wrong.
Well,
you know, because they got us somewhere else. But it certainly does seem the case that.
And Yaron way in the corner. He's just at the edge of his chair. He wants to get in here so bad. He's going to get in.
And this is, again, I think the problem with the idea of reason per se is that it's not a sufficiently differentiated idea to account for how it is that we actually operate in the world. And so, and and the AI types and the psychologists are really trying to sort that out. But see, one of the things that happened to me when I was arguing with Sam Harris about this, because Sam believes that you can derive values from facts, and more or less in an unmediated way, although he has some differences of opinion with himself about how unmediated that is. It's like, well, I mean...
Yes, he has differences of opinions with himself on a lot of this.
It's very difficult to be entirely coherent when you think through something that's complicated.
That's exactly right. Let's understand that this is hard. This is hard for all of us, and we should respect and appreciate and encourage each other. I encourage Sam Harris to perfect his arguments and refine them, and you want to deal with the best arguments.
There's likely to be inconsistencies in your argument because it's so complicated, but it looks to me like it's actually formally impossible to derive values from facts in an unmediated sense. You need something to mediate between the facts and the values. And then I would also say it looks like it's impossible for you to derive that structure merely over the course of your life. You don't have enough time. You're not smart enough and you don't have enough time. And so... And
this, again, if you... it's not released yet, but there are bootleg versions of the audio version, and you can make out. And if you look at the axioms that I put in my axiomatic God versus anti-masturbation God video from a couple of weeks ago, in Jordan Peterson's axioms and how he laid them out, I mean, a critical piece of his axiom is no single one of us human beings... Let's say you could make a human being in a lab and raise that person in a clean room without any contact with human beings or civilization. Would it be a human being? Oh boy, this is going to get complicated in the world. But that's the question. And because Peterson's basically saying, no, we are all heirs of this long process of human heredity and civilization and religion, and we are all heirs of this, and we cannot conceive of ourselves without it, and we cannot act with values and in the world without it. That's his big point.
You have an embodied biological platform, or you are that embodied biological platform, and it's actually the consequence of, let's say, at least in part, evolutionary pressures operating over about a 3.5 billion year period. And so it's possible that you can derive facts from values, but it takes you 3.5 billion years to do it properly.
It takes you 3.5 billion years to do it properly. Okay, what is you? What is you? Well, you is us, of course. It's us, but I'm not 3.5 billion years old. Or am I? Well, what am I? And now suddenly, again, theologically, this goes all kinds of interesting places, because the Bible talks like this, and theology works with ideas like these. Federal headship. In Adam, all became sinners. Well, something happened at the beginning, and we all went down this route together. This idea of original sin. Again, if you read theology, and not just new stuff, that new theology has not yet been tested. Probably a lot of the new, and this is, in a sense, people have this bias, this, as C.S. Lewis says, chronological snobbery. Well, I don't want to read old theology. I want to read the up-to-date stuff. Well, the up-to-date stuff has not been tested. You read Augustine. That stuff has been battle-tested for hundreds of years, and people are still actively translating Augustine's work and doing new scholarship on Augustine. Why? Because there's so much in it that has been so applicable to how many different cultures. And again, when you get, well, okay, well, find me a book that's been more translated, more applicable, that's been used by more cultures at more times and places. Yeah, it's this book. It's this book. So you want to read the book that forms the world? Well, this is it. You say, well, I don't want to read that book. It's got miracles and stories and stuff in it. Yeah, and it's a really hard book to read. And you can just keep reading it and studying it. But what's interesting, again, as I talk to the Jordan Peterson fandom out there, what's everybody looking forward to? The biblical series. Well, maybe that's the tiny selection of people that are interested in the same things I'm interested. It could be a selection bias, sure, but this is what we're doing.
Properly. And what you have that allows you to do that in your life, to look at a set of facts and to decide how to proceed, is the intermediation, the unconscious intermediation of that unbelievably deep structure. And when I've said to Sam something that really annoys him, I said, well, you think you're an atheist, but you're actually not. What I'm actually saying is your conscious apprehension of yourself is a very thin layer that's laid on top of what you are, because you don't know who you are. And most of what you do is unconscious. And that's actually there isn't a serious cognitive psychologist in the world who doesn't think that most of what you do is unconscious, by the way.
That's worth hearing again, okay? Because as a pastor, someone who watches people behave within a fairly rigorous moral, ethical system, we are unaware of what we do and why we do it. And I see this of myself. And Peterson, and Peterson has taught me a ton about this, listening to his stories and listening to his lectures and forcing me to ponder myself. And if you're a Christian and you're trying to deal with sin, well, what is a Christian trying to deal with sin? Well, there's this objective standard, there's this ethical standard out there that you cannot comply with. And when they're Christians like, well, I haven't sinned in years, it's like, you're probably not really paying a lot of attention. Because, and C.S. Lewis brings this out, the crazy thing about the moral law is that we generate a law and we say we should all keep it, and it's a law we can't keep. Well, what's up with that? Well, we are mysteries to ourselves, and this is where Yaron is going to get in, and in my opinion, it's not going to be good. So let's listen to what Peterson just said again, because this is deeply true.
And I would say work do the separation, the unconscious intermediation of that unbelievably deep structure. It allows you to do that in your life, to look at a set of facts and to decide how to proceed, is the intermediation, the unconscious intermediation of that unbelievably deep structure. And when I've said to Sam something that really annoys him, I said, well, you think you're an atheist, but you're actually not. What I'm actually saying is your conscious apprehension of yourself is a very thin layer that's laid on top of what you are, because you don't know who you are. And most of what you do is unconscious. And that's actually there isn't a serious cognitive psychologist in the world who doesn't think that most of what you do is unconscious, by the way.
The Apostle Paul thought it. That's long before psychology. Augustine knew it. Deep thinkers about the human condition have known this and recognized it, and this then becomes the topic of dramas. This is the story behind The Sopranos, and why Tony Soprano wants to find Dr. Melfi to have him fix his anxiety disorder. And Dr. Melfi, well, what should Tony Soprano do? What should she do? Should he be having anxiety given the way he's living his life?
And I would say that unconscious has a structure, and that's a narrative structure, and that narrative structure is deep. And so that even if you describe yourself as atheistic, because in the explicit content of your thinking you see no room for the grounding of your conceptions in divinity, I would say, well, that isn't how your unconscious is structured at all. And you might object, but then the objection you have is, well, how is it structured?
Yeah.
How is it structured, since it's 99% of you?
I think I've got a guy over there with a slight objection. He almost jumped out of his chair. All right.
How is your unconscious structured?
Which, by the way, I think this is particularly interesting because I think you have a lot of agreements with Jordan on plenty of stuff, and I think you have a lot of agreements with Sam on plenty of stuff, but this is where this argument has gotten down to. It's a really, really rich place, I think.
Well, I mean, this is the big issue, right? So I have agreements with Sam on stuff but we have different reasons for having that agreement. And so, for example, I agree with him in is-odd, but his conception of is-odd is very different than our conception of is-odd. And he has no free will in that conception, so that blows my mind, how you can even talk about an is-odd and values without having...
Now, he's saying is-ought. This is the fact-value distinction. And he's talking about Sam Harris, and this is Yaron Brook. I'm going to back it up a little bit so you can hear it again, because this is important what he's going through.
Agreements with Sam on stuff for different, but we have different reasons for having that agreement. And so, for example, I agree with him in is-odd, but his conception of is-odd is very different than our conception of is-odd. And he has no free will in that conception, so that blows my mind, how you can even talk about an is-odd and values without having free will.
Yes, and Yaron is dead. How can you talk about is, ought, and values without having free will, or why you would even talk about them?
And he talks about choices without free will, which is challenging.
Challenging, yes, and he's got a smile on his face for you audio listeners. Choices without free will.
We see
and
that
then
maybe we'll do that on the
choices without free will, which is challenging.
We see that tied around. Maybe we'll do that on the
Rubin
report at some
point. We might come to some certain agreement about I don't know, rights or something. With Jordan, although I think even our conception of rights is going to be a little different, because I don't see how you can get to rights without understanding the role of reason and how reason functions and what the enemy of reason ultimately is, which is what I mentioned earlier, which is force. So
the enemy of reason is force. Now go back and listen to what Sam Harris said in the other video. Now, rights and reason, that gets interesting too here. So it's a good conversation.
So I think, to go back to your original question way back, I think there's no way for us to have different foundations and not come out with different conclusions.
Right. Because this is how reason works. It's kind of like a tower, and you build it. Or if you want to think about reason like a math algorithm, that's how Sam Harris was imagining it. If you have bad data or different data at the beginning of your algorithm, you'll have different data at the end of your algorithm. And this is where, again, you're getting into the fact-value distinction. Reason might help guide you if you say, well, this would be reasonable to do, but then suddenly you're asking questions about the starting point, and you also have questions of telos or end or goal. How will I get from A to B? Well, that depends what A is, and it depends how want and where B is. It depends on your goal. Well, I want to have a goal where everyone in the world listens to me and I get everything I want. Oh, okay. You got a real problem with A because you're a little human being in the midst of a whole bunch of human beings who kind of want something like it. And so there's probably going to be a lot of blood on your hands. And that's usually the way history goes.
We're going to have to come up with different conclusions. Now, we might agree on certain issues in politics, but for example, I think we're going to disagree quite profoundly on ethics, right? I think, just watching some of Jordan's things on sacrifice and so on the role of Jesus or our view of Jesus is going to be very, very profoundly different. And that affects human behavior. That affects individual human behavior. So they're going to be, you can't start with different premises and develop them and come up with exactly the same way and say, okay, we agree on this stuff. But no, these things have profound consequences. The disagreements have profound consequences. Now, when I think of my subconscious, I don't think of it as this. And again, I'm not a philosopher, not a psychologist, so this is the way a layman in these terms would think. I think of my subconscious not as a 99% darkness down there, right? I think of it as something that accumulated information, conclusions, values, decisions that I've made since childhood, since before I was completely conscious of them,
Notice where he draws the boundaries for himself. Because what he's about to say, I think, is best described as naive.
I have access to some of them, hopefully cognitive psychology and psychology can help me get access to more of them. But they're accessible to me. They're not some mystery. They're accessible to me. And that when I am making a decision in life, I try to make it based on what I know, not based on what I don't know that's back there, right? So I try to accumulate facts. This is the finance guy in me, right, or the reality guy in me. I try to accumulate facts and integrate them and try to distinguish between which facts are legitimate and which facts are illegitimate, and try to integrate them and try to make a decision based on logic, based on reality. And, you know, sometimes my emotion will say, and this is my subconscious maybe speaking, don't do that, or that's a bad thing. But so what, right? If reality and the facts are with me, then I'll ignore that subconscious. So I don't see us as we've got some choice over here, but we're really driven by the subconscious. The subconscious is there for me to explore, and I become a better person as I know my subconscious better. I understand where my emotions are coming from, and I understand that better. But at the end of the day, when I make a choice out there, it's based on reality and facts. And
see that.
And when I hear that, I think, I don't know if I don't know how to. Maybe I could pose an argument that might elicit a little deeper understanding of the mystery of human beings. But I wonder, you know, to get back to, let's say, Romans 7, the good that I would do, I don't do. And this is Paul's formulation of I'm a mystery to myself. The sin I say I don't want to do, I do. And this is what it means to be a human being. This is what it means that we live in the midst of this enormously complex world, so much of which we are not aware of and can't articulate. Now maybe, you know, and just across the spectrum, someone who's been doing any psychological work, been in therapy to discover the mystery of themselves, or someone who's been doing meditation to discover the mystery of themselves, or someone who reads history to discover the mystery of themselves, or someone who has been reading literature or philosophy, or we are mysteries to ourselves, and we act out of programs that we have not written. And especially for materialists that assert such a constructed view of the universe. And again, this is Jordan Peterson's, this is his wheelhouse. This is the heart of what I think is the most interesting stuff about Jordan Peterson. That not just now again, we're into metaphors here, and let's use a clockwork metaphor. Not just the machinery within me, the hardware of the computer that is programmable by the software. But, you know, you might say, okay, so a person who is adopted as a child, identical twins separated at birth. Well, that's kind of the point of those interesting things, that identical twins separated by birth have some peculiar commonalities. And so then we say, it's not the software, it's the hardware. Well, how far culturally do they have to be separated for their expressions and their persons to change? And what about the Dutch starvation experiments that get into epigenetics, how certain characteristics and behaviors pass on from one generation to another? And what Peterson says far earlier is, you know, there's not a cognitive psychologist in the world who doesn't recognize what Jordan Peterson is saying. And the other person's like, well, I'm not a psychologist, but I think, you know, I've had experiences from birth and I can accept that, and I try to apply reason to it. And I listen to that and I think, that is such a naive conception of a human being, and he's old enough to have screwed up enough in his life to know better, because it's usually in your screw-ups that the mystery of yourself is confronted, and it's sitting down with a drug addict or an alcoholic or someone who has not necessarily the victim of someone else, but the perpetrator, when they sit down and they say, I simply need to do this and I don't know why and I can't stop. Where does this come from? So that's these two videos, and I didn't do a lot of PowerPoint with it, but I thought that they're really helpful to place side by side to get a sense of Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and then bring these other conversation partners into the room, because in many ways, I think these two things lay out a lot of the arguments about that are surrounding the agenda of Jordan Peterson. And I think perhaps the reason there isn't a Christian involved, and maybe that's why I stick my beak in, not an insignificant beak, I may add. I stick my beak in is because these conversations are God haunted, and yeah, you don't have a major Christian academic on stage like Alvin Plantinga or Neil Plantinga's younger brother, who's a tremendously sharp theologian, or Bishop Barron, or you can't find any smart Christians who aren't interested in these conversations. There's lots of smart Christians that aren't interested in these conversations. Are you afraid of having the Christians involved in these conversations? Maybe you should be. Anyway, I've still got to do a rough draft for Friday. Today, I don't know if I'll post this today or Saturday.